Before I tell you about the $3.2 million wire transfer sitting in my business account, I need to explain why my entire family spent 14 months telling anyone who would listen that I had dropped out of life completely, that I was somewhere in the Southwest, broken, unemployed, and too ashamed to come home. I was 29 years old. I had never missed a bill payment in my life. But if you called my aunt in Tucson right now and asked her about me, she would lower her voice and say something like, "Oh, honey, it's just so sad what happened to her. She had so much potential." Drop a comment right now and tell me your age and where you're listening from. And hit subscribe. You're on Ruby Vengeance, and you are going to want to hear how this ends. 14 months before I sat across a conference table in Austin and watched a venture partner sign his name on a term sheet, I was standing in the parking lot of a post office in Flagstaff, Arizona, holding a greeting card I hadn't opened yet. It was from my aunt, my mother's older sister. The envelope had been forwarded twice. The handwriting on the front was careful and deliberate, the kind of penmanship that belongs to a woman who takes her time with things she considers important. I opened it. The card had a watercolor sunrise on the front. Inside, my aunt had written, "We're all thinking of you during this difficult season. Healing takes courage. You don't have to face this alone." I stood in that parking lot for a long time. I wasn't healing. I was working 80-hour weeks. I had 2 active client contracts, a business license I'd filed 3 months earlier, and a laptop that had been running so hot for so long that I kept it on a cooling rack I'd bought from a kitchen supply store. But according to my family, I had suffered some kind of unspecified collapse, and I was somewhere quiet and disconnected, putting myself back together. I had been gone for 4 months at that point. I had left my parents' house in Scottsdale in a hurry, with 1 bag and very little explanation. I did not leave a forwarding address. I did not call when I landed. Here's what they told people instead. My younger brother. I'll call him my brother because that's the most generous thing I can still call him. Had opened a custom furniture workshop 18 months earlier. He had a gift for woodworking, genuinely, but he had the financial instincts of someone who had never once been told no. He bought a commercial space in Old Town Scottsdale before he had a single paying client. He imported specialty hardwoods from suppliers in Oregon and Quebec before he'd even finished building his website. Within a year, he was behind on his lease, behind on his supplier accounts, and calling my father every Sunday night to talk about how the market was harder than he expected. Around the same time, my grandmother on my father's side passed away after a short illness. She was sharp until the very end, the kind of woman who read the financial section of the newspaper every morning and underlined things with a red pen. She left me $65,000 in a direct bequest. Not to my parents, not split across the family, to me, specifically with a note that said she hoped I'd use it to build something that was mine. I had the money in my account for 11 days before my father sat me down at the kitchen table. He didn't ask, he explained. He told me that my brother was in a difficult position, that family looked out for each other, that the money my grandmother left me was really an extension of what she would have wanted for all of us. He pushed a piece of paper across the table. It was a personal loan agreement, informal, no notary, no interest rate specified, for $50,000. My brother was sitting across from me scrolling through his phone. I picked up the paper. I read it. I set it back down on the table and I said no. The silence that followed was the kind that recalibrates a family. I packed a bag the next morning. I didn't make a scene. I didn't leave a note explaining my reasoning, because I had learned by then that explaining yourself to people who have already decided you're wrong is a waste of vocabulary. I booked a one-way bus ticket to Flagstaff, where a college friend had a spare room and no obligation to report my whereabouts to anyone. My parents needed a story for the gap I left behind. They couldn't tell the Scottsdale Country Club crowd that their daughter had walked out because they tried to redirect her inheritance into her brother's failing business. That version made them look calculating, so they built a different version. They told people I had been struggling, that the pressure of trying to make it on my own had finally caught up with me, that I had hit a wall emotionally, and that they were giving me space to work through it. They used words like burnout and episode and finding her footing again. When pressed for details, my mother would get a look on her face, pained, private, the expression of a woman carrying a burden she's too gracious to fully explain. And people would nod and stop asking. My aunt sent that card because she believed them. I was not burned out. I was furious and focused, which are not actually opposites. The month after I arrived in Flagstaff, I registered an LLC in Arizona. I named it Ridgeline Consulting. A ridge is the highest point of a roof. It's the structural spine that holds everything else up, and it's the last thing standing after a storm. I had been thinking about that image a lot. The filing cost me $50 and an afternoon. The corporate veil was established. Everything I earned from that point forward would flow into a business account that my name didn't appear on in any public registry. I had 3 months of freelance accounting contracts lined up. I had a degree in finance and 4 years of experience as a corporate analyst before I quit to try to build something of my own. I worked from my friend's kitchen table. I worked from coffee shops. I worked from a corner booth at a diner that let me stay for 3 hours if I ordered enough food. I was building a tax advisory and bookkeeping platform for small businesses, specifically for the kind of sole proprietors and family-owned operations that couldn't afford a full-time CFO but were constantly making expensive financial decisions based on guesswork. I knew the market. I had spent years watching business owners misread their own cash flow statements and wonder why they kept running out of money 3 weeks before a big payout. 4 months in, I got the greeting card from my aunt. I did not call her to explain. I recognized, with the cold clarity that comes from a certain kind of loneliness, that the story my parents had constructed was functioning exactly the way they intended. It was holding the social fabric together while keeping me at a distance. If I called my aunt and said, "Actually, I'm fine. I'm in Flagstaff building a software company," she would tell my mother within the hour, and my parents would pivot the narrative instantly. They would say I was in denial, that this was the illness talking. I had watched them do this before. I knew the mechanism, so I didn't call. I went back to my laptop and I kept building. What I didn't know in those first months was that the story had already moved past social management. My parents weren't just telling people I was struggling, they were collecting. My cousin, my mother's niece, a sweet woman who genuinely loved me and had no reason to doubt what she was hearing, told me later that my mother had shown up at a family dinner in October with a printed breakdown of what she called my recovery expenses. There was no recovery. There were no expenses. But the document looked professional, and it described therapy costs and temporary housing support and medication that insurance wouldn't cover. And by the end of that dinner, my cousin had written a personal check for $3,000. She wasn't the only one. I found out about this the same way I found out about most things during that period, through my sister-in-law. My brother's wife is one of the sharpest people I have ever met. She grew up in a working-class family in Charlotte, put herself through college on academic scholarships, and was working as a senior compliance officer at a financial services firm when she married into our family. She had my brother's number before the first anniversary. She saw my parents clearly within the first year. We had never been close in the obvious way. No phone calls, no girls' weekends. But we had a language. Raised eyebrows across the table at Thanksgiving. A specific look when my brother said something that made no sense financially, but everyone nodded at anyway. When I left Scottsdale, I didn't tell her where I was going, but I set up a secure channel between us before I left, an encrypted messaging app that my father had no visibility into. Her first message to me came in late November. It was 3 sentences. Your mother held a dinner. She passed around a document with your name on it. Your Aunt Charlene wrote a check. I stared at my phone. Then I asked her to send me everything she could document. What followed over the next several weeks was the kind of intelligence operation I had not anticipated needing. My sister-in-law attended every family gathering. She sat quietly, eating whatever my mother had cooked, watching my father work the room. She photographed documents she found on his desk. She tracked the checks. She built a log. The total, by December, was approaching $22,000. My parents had been collecting money from relatives and family friends under the pretense of covering my non-existent medical and housing costs. They were routing it into a joint account and using it to cover my brother's supplier invoices and back rent on his workshop. I was sitting on a folding chair in a rented room in Flagstaff when my sister-in-law sent me a photograph of the spreadsheet she'd built. The numbers were color-coded. She had noted the date of each deposit, the source, and where the money had gone. It was meticulous and damning, and I recognized immediately that it had crossed a legal threshold. Soliciting funds across state lines using fabricated documentation is not a family disagreement. It is wire fraud. I did not go to the police immediately. I had a reason. Ridgeline Consulting was 3 months away from a milestone I had been working toward for almost a year. I had built a functional beta of my advisory platform, and I had gotten it in front of 2 seed investors who wanted to see 12 weeks of performance data before they would commit. Institutional investors do not back founders whose names are attached to active federal investigations, even as the victim. The optics are too complicated, the liability too uncertain. I needed the funding secured before I could detonate the situation with my family. So I waited. I documented. I had my sister-in-law keep building the ledger. I kept my head down and my code running. In January, the situation escalated. I had a small rental property in Scottsdale, a 1-bedroom condo I'd purchased 2 years earlier with money I'd saved from bonuses and freelance work. The mortgage was on autopay through a separate account. The place sat empty while I was in Flagstaff, but it was mine, debt service running quietly in the background. My father knew about the property. He had, in fact, advised me not to buy it, and I had ignored him, and he had not forgotten this. I was in the middle of a client call when my phone buzzed with an alert from my mortgage servicer. Someone had attempted to access my homeowner portal from an unrecognized device. The attempt had failed on the second authentication step. I knew before I even checked the login metadata who it was. My father is not technically sophisticated, but he is persistent and he is resourceful within the limits of his knowledge. He knew my social security number. He had copies of tax returns from years when he'd pressured me to let him help with my filing. He knew the answers to every standard security question: mother's maiden name, childhood street, first pet. He had tried to use that information to access my homeowner portal and initiate a home equity line of credit, the proceeds of which would have been wired to my brother's business account. He had gotten through the first gate. He had not anticipated the second one. Before I left Scottsdale, I had set up hardware key authentication on every financial account I owned. It's a physical device, looks like a small USB drive, that generates a unique cryptographic code every 30 seconds. You cannot log in without it. You cannot reset it remotely. My father had my passwords and my personal history, and all the right answers to all the right questions, and none of it mattered without the key on my keychain. The portal locked him out after 3 failed attempts and flagged the session as suspicious. I received the alert within minutes. I did not panic. I called a real estate attorney in Phoenix that same afternoon, a woman named. I'll just call her my attorney because she's still working for me and I don't want her calendar flooded, and I explained what had happened. She filed a notice of contested title with the Maricopa County Recorder's Office before close of business. The filing cost $20. From the moment it was stamped, no lender in the country could process a home equity application on that property without a court order. The asset was frozen. My father tried the bank branch the next morning. He presented himself as my authorized representative. The loan officer ran a title search and came back with the contested notice. My father left the branch empty-handed and, according to my sister-in-law's account, did not speak to my mother for the rest of the evening. The cognitive dissonance must have been significant. He believed I was somewhere adrift, disconnected from financial systems, too scattered to manage my own affairs. He could not explain how a woman supposedly incapable of functioning had managed to file a precise legal instrument with the county recorder's office the night before. I did not explain it to him. I let him live in that confusion. By February, Ridgeline had its 12 weeks of data. The platform had processed over 400 client transactions across 32 small businesses. Error rate was under 2%. Client retention was 91% at the 8-week mark. I had built something real. I flew to Austin for 3 days and pitched to 2 seed investment groups. The second meeting went long. At the end of it, the lead partner pushed a term sheet across the table and said he wanted to move quickly. I did not sign it immediately. I asked for 48 hours. I had one problem left. One of the investment groups had run a preliminary background search on me before the meeting. The lead partner hadn't raised it directly, but he had asked, obliquely, whether there was anything in my personal history he should know about before the firm conducted their formal due diligence. I recognized the phrasing. Someone had found something in the search, likely the social media threads where relatives had posted prayers and vague references to my situation. It wasn't damning on its own, but in the hands of a cautious risk analyst, it could become a question mark that killed the deal. I went back to my hotel room, ordered room service, and opened my laptop. I had documentation, I had my sister-in-law's spreadsheet, the login attempt metadata from my mortgage portal, and the contested title filing. What I needed was a way to present the situation to my investors, not as a personal liability, but as a demonstration of exactly the skills they were about to fund. The next morning, before the 48-hour window closed, I emailed the lead partner. I asked for a brief follow-up call. He gave me 30 minutes. I spent 20 of them walking him through a structured presentation I'd built the night before. I didn't use emotional language. I didn't describe my family as abusive or toxic or any of the other words that make investors shift in their chairs. I used the vocabulary of risk management. I explained that a localized reputational threat had been manufactured by immediate family members in connection with an inheritance dispute, that the threat had been documented with court-admissible evidence, that I had implemented legal and technical countermeasures, and that the relevant parties had zero access to my business entity, my intellectual property, or my financial infrastructure. I told him that a founder who cannot protect her own balance sheet cannot be trusted to protect his firm's capital. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've had founders fall apart over a bad Yelp review. You documented your family committing wire fraud and used it to pitch me. Sign the term sheet." I signed it that afternoon, $3.2 million. Wired to Ridgeline Consulting's corporate account within 5 business days. I sat in my hotel room after the call and did not cry. I did not open a bottle of champagne. I ordered a second cup of coffee from room service and opened my laptop and started reviewing the integration timeline for our next feature build. The funding was the foundation. The work was the building. While I was in Austin, my sister-in-law was finalizing her own exit. She had been planning it for months. She had consulted a divorce attorney in Charlotte, transferred her personal savings to an account in her name only, and documented my brother's financial negligence with the same forensic precision she applied to her professional work. She had watched him accept money she knew was stolen. She had watched him refuse to take any accountability for the collapse of his business while their household carried the debt of his decisions. She had decided she was done. She coordinated the timing with me. My parents' anniversary party was scheduled for the last Saturday of February. My mother had been planning it for 3 months. It was a dinner party for 40 people, close family, business associates, country club friends. My mother had hired a caterer. My father had reserved a private room at a restaurant in North Scottsdale that neither of them could afford. The party served 2 purposes. It was a celebration, yes, but it was also a fundraiser. My parents had exhausted their closest contacts with the earlier rounds of fake donation collection. The anniversary party was a fresh audience, people who knew my parents as pillars of the community, who had heard only vague references to my situation, and who would be moved by an intimate evening to contribute to the family's ongoing burden. My mother had apparently planned to make a toast partway through dinner. She had a framed photograph of me from high school on the table near the entrance. She had a small basket for cards. I knew about the basket because my sister-in-law had been in the room when my mother set it up. I had spent 2 weeks preparing. My attorney had drafted 2 civil complaints. The first was defamation per se, the deliberate spread of false statements about my mental and professional fitness, specifically designed to damage my livelihood. The second was civil fraud, the solicitation of funds under false pretenses using manufactured documentation with a detailed accounting of every check collected and where the money went. The complaints were backed by 34 pages of exhibits. My sister-in-law's spreadsheet, the login attempt logs from my mortgage portal, photographs of the forged expense document my mother had circulated at the October dinner, sworn statements from 2 relatives who had given money and were now, upon learning the truth, furious enough to cooperate. I had also, the week before the party, reached out directly to my Aunt Charlene. I didn't ambush her. I sent her an email with the simple subject line, "I want you to hear the truth from me directly." Attached my business registration documents, my LinkedIn profile, 3 client testimonials, and a photograph of me in my Flagstaff workspace. I attached a single-page summary of what my parents had told people and what had actually been happening during those 14 months. I told her she could do with that information whatever she felt was right. My Aunt Charlene is 63 years old and has been a property manager in Tucson for 25 years. She did not become sentimental. She called a family WhatsApp group that I wasn't in and shared my email. She wrote above it, "Read this before Saturday. The party began at 7. By 8:15, the caterer had finished the first course. My father was at the head of the table, doing what he did best, holding court, managing the room, projecting the measured warmth of a man who had seen hardship and endured it with grace. My mother was moving between conversations, accepting sympathetic squeezes of the arm from women who had known her since the kids were small. My sister-in-law sat at the far end of the table, drinking water, watching. Her phone was in her lap. She had coordinated with my attorney's office on the timing. The process servers, 2 of them, from a firm in Phoenix, had instructions to arrive at 8:30 after the appetizers before the main course. She had chosen that window deliberately, early enough that the room was full and focused, late enough that people had relaxed into the evening and let their guards down. At 8:27, my mother stood up and tapped her glass. She began with a story about how she and my father had built their life together. It was well told. She was, genuinely, a skilled performer. She moved through the years, the early apartment, the first house, the kids, and then she slowed, and her voice got softer, and she began to talk about the difficulty of the past year. She talked about the worry of having a child who was struggling. She talked about the weight of it. She thanked everyone in the room for their support and their generosity, and she gestured toward the basket near the entrance, and she said that every contribution helped. The front door opened. 2 men in business casual clothing walked in. One of them asked the hostess, one of the caterer's staff, for Richard, and she pointed to my father. The first server walked to the head of the table. He stated my father's full name. He placed the envelope on the table in front of him. He said, "You've been served," and stepped back. The second server crossed to where my brother was sitting and placed his envelope in front of him. My brother looked at it like it was in a language he didn't speak. My sister-in-law stood up, picked up her coat from the back of her chair, and walked to the door. She didn't look back. She didn't make a speech. She had spent years being a supporting character in my family's narrative, and she was finished. The door closed behind her with a quiet, final click. My father opened his envelope. The first document he saw was his own name, printed in the header of a civil complaint under the official seal of the Maricopa County Superior Court. The room was completely silent. My Aunt Charlene was sitting 3 seats down from my mother. She had read the email. She had shared it in the family group. She had spent the past 4 days carrying the knowledge of what her sister had done. She had come to the party because she wanted to look my parents in the eye. She was watching my father's face as he read. She did not feel pity. The table began to fracture. 2 of my father's business associates excused themselves within minutes, citing early morning commitments. The women around my mother moved slightly away, the way people do when they sense something shifting but don't want to be caught in it. My aunt asked, in a voice that was very calm and very clear, whether my father would like to explain the expense documentation that had been distributed the previous October. He could not. My mother tried. She said the lawsuit was a misunderstanding, that I had always been dramatic, that stress had caused me to distort things. She said the word misunderstanding 3 times in the same minute, which is what people say when they have no other vocabulary left. My brother was still staring at his envelope. Halfway across the country, I was in my Flagstaff apartment. I had a tracking notification from my attorney's office, a small green confirmation that both documents had been delivered. I read it, made a note in my case file, and closed the tab. My phone buzzed with a message from my sister-in-law. It was a single line, "Done. I'm out." I sent back a thumbs up and went back to the feature build I'd been working on all week. The fallout was not clean or cinematic. Real fallout rarely is. My parents did not collapse immediately. They hired a local attorney and tried to settle. They offered to sign a non-disclosure agreement promising never to mention my mental health history again if I dropped the fraud claims. I rejected it without deliberation. A sealed settlement is a door left ajar. A public judgment is a wall. They couldn't afford to fight. The donations they collected had been spent on my brother's supplier accounts, on the catering deposit for the anniversary party, on a car payment. They had no liquid capital to fund a defense against a defamation and civil fraud claim with 34 pages of exhibits. Their attorney withdrew within 3 weeks. They missed the response deadline. A default judgment in a civil case is not a dramatic courtroom moment. It is a form filed by your attorney with a court date and a judge who reviews the evidence and rules in the absence of any rebuttal. My attorney submitted the case on a Tuesday afternoon. The judge reviewed it Thursday morning. He ruled in my favor on both counts. The court issued a permanent injunction. My parents were prohibited from making any public statement about my mental health, my professional history, or my business entities. If they violated it, if my father mentioned me at a country club dinner or my mother sent another email to the family, they faced immediate civil contempt proceedings and potential criminal referral. Their false narrative was legally terminated. My Aunt Charlene contacted the other relatives who had donated. My parents, facing the judgment and the pressure of people who now knew exactly what had happened, agreed to return the money. It took the sale of some furniture and a retirement account, early withdrawal to do it, but every check was refunded. The country club membership lapsed when the dues stopped. The house in Scottsdale went on the market 8 months later. The neighborhood they had performed their perfect family life in for 20 years scattered them without a second glance. My brother lost the workshop. The suppliers he'd been paying with stolen money cut him off once the capital dried up. His landlord filed for non-payment of lease. The business that had been the justification for everything my parents had done, the reason the inheritance had to be redirected, the reason I had to be diminished and disappeared, was seized and auctioned. He was left with debt, a pending divorce, and a resume that listed his failed business under the title Independent Craftsman. He eventually took a job at a mid-sized construction supply company outside Phoenix, doing inventory and procurement coordination. It was steady work. Honest work, probably. His first week on the job, his manager walked him through the software platform the company had recently adopted, a cloud-based financial management and supply chain tool for small to mid-cap businesses. It was Ridgeline. He called me once, 3 months after everything had settled. I recognized the number. I had left it unblocked intentionally because I knew he would call when he ran out of other options. His voice was quieter than I remembered. He said he hadn't understood what was happening. He said he was sorry. He said he needed a loan to cover his attorney's fees from the divorce proceedings. He used the words family duty. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I told him that I remembered exactly what family duty had looked like at our parents' kitchen table. I told him that I had watched him stare at his phone while our father pushed a loan agreement across the table toward me, and that his silence that afternoon was a choice. I told him that explaining why you made a choice doesn't change what the choice was. I told him to retain competent legal counsel and contact a nonprofit credit counseling service, both of which are free in Arizona. Then I wished him well and I ended the call, and I added his number to the blocked list. It was not a dramatic moment. I did not feel triumphant. I felt the specific, quiet relief that comes from enforcing a boundary you spent a long time knowing you needed, and even longer actually drawing. My sister-in-law moved back to Charlotte. She took a senior position at a regional bank and is, by all accounts, thriving in the way she always would have been if she hadn't spent 5 years managing the collateral damage of our family's dysfunction. We talk regularly now, not about the past, mostly about work and logistics, and the occasional recommendation for a good audiobook. She is my chief compliance officer at Ridgeline on a fractional basis, and she's terrifyingly good at it. Ridgeline Consulting closed its Series A 8 months after the seed round, $11.4 million. The platform now supports over 3,000 small businesses across 22 states. We have a team of 14 in Austin and a small satellite office I keep running in Flagstaff, partly for logistical reasons and partly because I like the altitude. There is a condo in Scottsdale that I still own. The contested title notice was lifted when the legal matter resolved. I rent it to a young woman who is finishing her master's degree in environmental science. She pays on time and sends me a message every few months to report that everything is fine. I appreciate the precision of that. My parents live in a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of the valley now. I know this because my Aunt Charlene told me, not because I have kept any kind of tabs. She tells me these things the way you report weather, not to solicit a response, just to mark the record. I don't have a relationship with my parents. That is not a wound I'm carrying. It is a decision I made with full information, and I hold it the way I hold every decision I've made since I walked out of that kitchen, carefully, clearly, and without apology. There is a specific kind of family that operates like a closed system. Everyone inside it has a role, and the roles are non-negotiable, and the energy of the system depends on everyone staying in place. The daughter who earns money is the daughter who provides it. The son who fails is the son who needs protecting. The parents who control the narrative are the ones who define reality for everyone else. The thing about a closed system is that it only works while everyone inside it agrees to stay. The night I said no at that kitchen table, I didn't know I was walking out of a system. I thought I was just drawing a line about money. But systems don't have lines. They have walls. And the walls are made of other people's compliance. When one person stops complying, when one person picks up their bag and walks out without leaving a forwarding address, the whole architecture has to reckon with the load it was never actually carrying on its own. My grandmother understood this. She had lived inside a version of that system for decades, and she had built her own walls within it. Her finances, her property, her paperwork, quietly, precisely, and with the calm patience of a woman who had decided she was going to outlast it. She left me $65,000 and a note that said she hoped I'd use it to build something that was mine. I did. If any part of this resonates with you, if you sat at a kitchen table and felt the specific weight of a document pushed across it by someone who expected you to sign without reading, subscribe to Ruby Vengeance. We tell stories like this because they are not rare. They happen in pristine houses, on quiet streets, in families with good furniture and maintained lawns, and a story for every occasion. We peel back the wallpaper. We read the fine print. We don't leave without the $65,000. See you in the next one. There's something nobody tells you about being the person who finally says no. They frame it like a moment of strength, like you stood up straight and drew a line and everyone in the room understood what it meant. That's not how it felt at that kitchen table. It felt like dropping something heavy in a quiet house, loud for 1 second, then just gone. What I've come to understand, years out from that moment, is that actions compound. Not in a mystical way, not in any way that requires faith in something outside yourself. Just in the plain, mechanical way that choices accumulate into outcomes. My parents spent years building a system where loyalty meant silence, and silence meant compliance, and compliance meant the money kept moving the right direction. Every time that system worked, they trusted it more. Every time my brother's failures were covered, he learned that failure had no real cost. Every time I deferred, they assumed I always would. The system had logic. It just wasn't sustainable logic. What they didn't account for, what controlling people almost never account for, is that the person they're managing is also learning. Every dinner where I watched my father redirect a conversation, I was learning how narratives get constructed. Every time my mother deployed pity to extract something from a room, I was studying the mechanism. They taught me, without meaning to, exactly how the architecture worked. And when I finally left, I took that education with me. My grandmother understood something they didn't. She sat across a Monopoly board with me and talked about corporate veils and liability shields, not because she was preparing me for a specific fight, but because she understood that knowledge is the only asset no one can take by forging a signature. She gave me $65,000 and she gave me 20 years of quiet, precise lessons, and the second gift mattered more than the first. My sister-in-law built a color-coded spreadsheet in her private office and said nothing at Sunday dinners for months. That is not a small thing. Integrity under pressure, the ability to know what you know and wait for the right moment, rather than the satisfying one. That is a discipline most people never develop. She had it. It came from somewhere in her that had nothing to do with our family, and it was the reason she walked out of that room clean. And my brother. I don't carry anger toward him the way I once thought I would. He was shaped by the same system that tried to shape me. He just agreed to its terms. The cost of that agreement was a resilience he never got to build. A reckoning he kept deferring until it arrived all at once and he had nothing to meet it with. He sits at a desk now and follows protocols built by the sister he once dismissed. And I don't think that's punishment. I think that's just what reality looks like when the cushion is finally gone. I think about the women who wrote checks at that October dinner. They weren't foolish. They were generous, and their generosity was exploited by people they trusted. The only thing that separated them from the truth was information, and the moment they had it, Charlene included, they acted on it immediately. People mostly do the right thing when they actually know what the right thing is. The hard work is making sure they have the truth to work with. What I keep coming back to in the quiet of my office in Flagstaff is this. The $3.2 million didn't save me. The discipline did. The LLC filing saved me. The hardware key saved me. The contested title notice saved me. Each one of those decisions cost almost nothing in dollars, and everything in presence of mind. The ability to think clearly when someone is actively trying to make you feel small. That kind of clarity doesn't come from anger. It comes from knowing exactly what you're building and refusing to let anyone else define what it's worth. Build the wall around the thing before they decide it belongs to them. That's the whole lesson. Everything else follows from that.